Okay, thank you. I came to Iceland first time, I think, back in the 1970s, and I've been back several times since. I've had the chance to explore on foot multi-day walks in now several parts of Iceland. I've been to some of your offshore islands, and I've enjoyed your wonderful culture. It's a great country. I'm sure most of you have traveled enough to know quite how unique what you have here, both in terms of landscape and culture, is in Europe and indeed in the world. It's a real honor to be here, so thank you. When I travel a lot with my work. I've traveled over half the year for the last 25 years or more, but when I'm in the UK, I spend a lot of my time right on the edge of the Snowdonia National Park in Wales. And although it's very different from, obviously it's very different from Iceland, there's more people, but there are some overlaps. Talking in the ministry yesterday, quite a lot of the issues that you're discussing in Iceland are also issues that we discuss in the Snowdonia National Park. And we've had the national park for well over half a century now. So I'm going to draw on examples from around the world, but I will keep coming back to my home patch in this next talk. And what I've been asked to do is talk about what protected areas mean on a global sense. These national parks, nature reserves, wilderness areas, the multiplying areas around the world, some of the most iconic areas, what it means in terms of the people who live there, nearby, inside, and what it means to a country, what the values are, and what the obligations are. The costs and benefits. Of course, there are both costs and benefits. Protected areas cover about 15% of the world's land surface and ever larger areas of the ocean. And this has been a very, very rapid change. Modern protected areas first emerged, 2 or 3 of them at the end of the 19th century, but the huge majority have emerged very quickly. If you look at the graph of growth, it's been very rapid. Almost everyone in this room is old enough to have lived through the creation of at least half the world's protected areas. So it's a really new phenomenon. It's something we're still learning to manage, still fragile. They're set up in theory permanently. We don't know if that's the case. It'll be very interesting to see how countries react over time. And I think it's almost certainly the largest and fastest conscious change of management in history. I can't think of anything quite as analogous. Agriculture took far longer, urbanization took far longer. This is a very, very rapid change. This is going to be my only statistic, but basically there's now about 250,000 protected areas around the world. So it's a big, big thing. As you can see from the map, they're scattered around. Big areas of ocean already and big areas in some of the continents. And what protected areas mean is gradually changing as well. We started off really with iconic landscapes, with things like Yellowstone. More recently, there's been a big focus on biodiversity, the world's biodiversity crisis, endangered species of animals and plants, but also, and something that I'm going to come back to in the talk, places where natural resource management protects livelihood, environmental services. Cultural landscapes and seascapes as well as wild areas, not just wild places. And often with many, many people involved. It used to be the case that protected areas were set up and they were very much fenced areas, people were kept out. But now that we found that doesn't work, but we've also found that when people engage, the protection is stronger and people work through it. So places like Madagascar, we sat down and talked village by village with people about what protected area mean, what it meant to them, what it meant to their culture, what the costs and benefits were. So setting up a protected area is becoming a lot longer process because the only way it works is if you engage with everybody. And that means lots of different stakeholder groups. And some protected areas are very empty, no one goes there. Others are incredibly heavily visited. This one outside Seoul has something between 5 and 10 million visitors a year, every year. So if you think of the total visitor number that come to Iceland every year, which is massive now compared to what it used to be, double that goes to the one small area. So that's a kind of extreme. Many of them are empty, but they have very different feel because of that. I'm here, at least partly through IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. For those of you who don't know it, it's a slightly strange organization because it involves both government members, many governments and government departments are members, but also NGO members. So it's not quite a UN body, but it's a membership body that is driven by vote every few years. But what it does, there's a congress that members come together and vote on various resolutions, set the agenda of the union. And it's also unusual in that it has both a paid secretariat, but also 6 volunteer commissions. And the one that I'm most closely involved in is the World Commission on Protected Areas, which is around 2,000 volunteer members that have expertise in protected areas and provide a lot of the technical backstopping on global protected areas. And one of the roles that I've been most closely involved in, one of the roles that's been a key interest of the World Commission on Protected Areas, is setting guidelines for applying protected area management categories and the definition. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this now because this is key to the kind of debates that you're having in Iceland at the moment. This was done 10 years ago, roughly, and it's one of a series of attempts to set these issues. One of the things that came out when we looked at it 10 years ago was a slightly different definition of a protected area, and that was a surprise. We weren't expecting that. But it came out, a clearly defined geographical space, so it's an area, usually has fixed boundaries. In some cases, it may be, if it's a river or a shoreline, it may change, but of fixed boundaries. Recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means. So most protected areas are set up by governments, and they're legally protected, but a growing number are set up by other groups. We'll come back to this. To achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. That's what a protected area is, according to IUCN. IUCN has no official standing. What is a protected area in a country and reported to the United Nations is determined by the government of the country. IUCN, we can give advice, but no one has to take any notice of us. But many countries do, because the definition very much came out as a bottom-up process. Well over 1,000 people, many governments were involved in that debate, so many people take that as the definition. And they differ greatly in management objectives. Some of them are strictly protected areas. Some of them are areas that are open to tourism, agriculture, and other industries. This is where I grew up in the Trent Valley, in a very culturally changed, very heavily managed part of Britain. It's an old gravel workings that is a nature reserve. Until this year, there were still the gravel boats going through to the workings deeper down in the valley. So it was very much a working landscape, but a nature reserve, very important for the wildlife in that area. So, and very heavily visited. So, again, to stress, there's a big variation in what a protected area is. And attitudes are also changing. The old model of parks was very much that they were areas that people were cleared out of. And now that's really changing, and the exceptions, if they remain, are really highly vulnerable areas like, I don't know, an island offshore where birds are nesting, maybe you'd keep everyone away from. But most protected areas are open for people in varying degrees, and indeed, a lot of their value is that they bring in tourists, bring in local visitors. So this is very much at the core of what I want to talk about this afternoon, that IUCN recognizes 6 different management categories of protected areas, which mean that protected areas are not all homogeneous. They're not all the same way. So category 1, which, because it was a debated process, ended up with 1A and 1B, but they're really strict protection, either for nature, for very fragile biodiversity, where visitation is controlled, or for wilderness values. And that's something very interesting in Iceland, because you probably have bigger wilderness values than anywhere else in Europe. So you have the opportunity to use this category in the way that very few other places in Europe do. Then category 2, often called national park, though European national parks don't usually fall into this category, is big ecosystems that are also open for tourism. So something like the Serengeti area in Tanzania, which is largely set aside for the big migration of the ungulates, but wildebeest and zebra, but also very, very important for tourism for that country. So that kind of model. A lot of the North American protected areas are quite on that model. Natural monuments are much smaller areas that would protect a specific feature like a waterfall or a special rock formation. Habitat or species management areas are areas that are not large enough to be an ecosystem. There'll be a smaller habitat. They might well need some degree of management to keep them going because they aren't a functioning ecosystem, but set aside usually for the conservation of particular species. And then the last two, which I know are quite new within Iceland, are protected landscapes or seascapes, which are much more culturally changed areas. A lot of national parks in Europe fit into this because they've been managed for millennia. So setting aside wild land is impossible because it doesn't exist. But the cultural landscape has great richness. Something like some of the Mediterranean traditionally managed farmland, cork forest areas would fit very well into this managed area. And then the last one, managed resource areas, which are areas set aside for sustainable use of natural resources, usually very natural areas where one particular element is taken up, like rubber tappers in the Amazon jungle or fishing in a coral reef. Protected areas also differ with respect to who's in charge. Many are by governments, but they can also be co-managed, many different managers. That's an increasingly important area. They can be under private governance, private individuals, religious groups, companies, people running protected areas for profit under ecotourism, and a growing, a huge category in parts of the world is private reserves run by indigenous people. Something like 60 million hectares have been set aside in Australia in the last 20 years by Aboriginal people as protected areas. And we're seeing the same kind of things in the Amazon. So really big changes. And in some cases, they will actively work to bring in ecotourism. This is an ecotourism venture run by a group in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And putting those together, the various management categories and the various governance types, I don't go through this in detail, but you need to recognize that there's a wide variety of both the way protected areas are governed and the way that their management objectives. It's very, very varied. And IUCN's advice is that governments should set up the best system for them and then think about the category afterwards. Think what you need and then fit it in later. Just two or three other points. The categories come with a number of associated principles. The most important here is for IUCN, only those areas where the main objective is conserving nature can be considered protected areas. This can include many other goals. They could be sacred sites for indigenous people, they could have ecotourism ventures, they could have cultural values, but in the case of conflict, if there's a conflict between those values within a protected area, nature conservation should be a priority. That's a very important element. Then there's the 75% rule, which I think is really important in most contexts. The 75% rule basically says you need to make sure that's true in at least 3/4 of the area, recognizing that in many protected areas, particularly larger ones, there's going to be things already going on that it would be socially and culturally completely inappropriate to simply cut off. So there may be people already living there in villages, there may be tourist lodges, there may be fishing, indigenous fishing, maybe use of ecosystem services in an Icelandic context. That could well be some of the hydroelectric schemes, which are already in place. But as long as they don't take more than 1/4 of the land, and as long as they are not doing anything that is undermining the conservation values, that's fine, basically. It's a recognition that the world is already substantially changed, and we need to work with that. A lot of the work that we've done is, I'm not going to go through all of these, obviously, but a lot of the work we've done is looking at the ecosystem services from protected areas. And although if you remember in the definition that was mentioned at the end, actually the role of ecosystem services is being increasingly recognized. Whole range of things running from water values, disaster risk reduction, food security, crop wild relatives, health benefits of natural ecosystems. In a large part of the world, those are really being confined to protected areas because the natural ecosystems remaining are in protected areas. So actually protected areas we're relying on them for our ecosystem services. And the interesting thing is they're often the hidden and unrecognized benefits of protected areas. People don't think about it because they've always been there. This is my valley in Wales. I live just on the right of here. And it's a biosphere reserve. You can see that there's some natural landscape and cultural grazing. But several times of the year it floods. And it's supposed to flood. It's a floodplain. Now, if we'd built in there, we would have to canalize it, and it would be the water would run downstream, and other places would be flooded. This is clearly an important ecosystem service. But if I asked anyone in my village, they wouldn't recognize it as that because it's always been there. It works. One more example in Bogota, Chingaza National Park, which is this wonderful paramo vegetation you can just see in the front of the slide. That collects water, and because it condenses water from the heavy cloud cover that is often in Chingaza. And Chingaza provides very pure water to Bogota, to 80% of the people in the capital city of Colombia. And it's some of the most potable water in Colombia. It saves millions of dollars every year in terms of the not having to purify it as much. And yet, ask anyone in Bogota, they have no idea. They've never been there. They don't know. So one of the roles of protected area agencies is explaining these wider values. What does this mean for Iceland? I'm coming very near the end. You already have some fantastic protected areas. You have some World Heritage sites. You have another one under consideration, I know, and other protected areas. What would a bigger protected area mean? Well, I think I'm going to come back to Wales again. This is I live just behind the hills in the back of the picture, and we have within Snowdonia National Park we have many of the same issues that you have. In fact, we have them to a greater extent because we have many farms. We have little cultural enclaves in there. We have a lot of upland grazing, the same way you do of sheep. We have heavy tourism. Tourism is undoubtedly the biggest money earner now within Snowdonia, way bigger than farming. Farming is being subsidized and is really struggling. And indeed, many farmers now are benefiting from ecotourism. They're bringing in people for homestay. They have some other business on the side. And I can promise you when and if Brexit happens, then a lot of those farmers are going to be looking much more at ecotourism because a lot of the almost certain the subsidies are going to go down dramatically in the west of Britain. So we have a complex system of quite a large area in UK terms, not as large as the one you're talking about in the centre of Iceland, but one of the less settled areas. I mean, my county has less people in than anywhere else in England and Wales, but more than you have in the rural areas of Iceland, and a very long history of settlement, much longer than you have here. We go back thousands of years, and many places left that you can still see the results of that. So, building on that and what we've learned from there, what kind of things what sort of general messages would I like to put across? I mean, first of all, being a protected area doesn't mean that everything changes. It doesn't mean that everyone has to get out. It doesn't mean that people have to stop their traditional way of life. Hunting continues in protected areas under a sustainable system, many protected areas. So does agriculture, so does other things. The 75% rule is important there, but also more generally, the kind of way that you set up and determine the management objectives of the protected area. It does mean that it prevents actions from damaging nature conservation. If you set up a protected area, it doesn't just mean that everything immediately goes on exactly as it has before, otherwise there's no point in doing it. But it probably what it means most broadly is that the whole area is looked at under a single management plan, agreed with all stakeholders, that's critical, and with a conservation emphasis. Many protected areas have zones of varying levels of protection. In fact, most large protected areas do, and I'm pretty sure you would need something like that within Iceland. Some areas that were strictly protected, some areas that were much more cultural landscapes, some areas that you might want to set aside particularly for tourism. They require an understanding and explanation of available ecosystem services. As I said, most people, even people living inside protected areas, don't recognize those services. They're worth a lot of money, they're worth a lot of pain and hassle, and therefore it's very important that they're explained, understood, and looked after. And being a protected area also infers monitoring and evaluation. Making your plan, but also checking what happens over time. Is it working? Is conservation working? Are tourists happy? Are the ecosystem services continuing to function? Are the local stakeholders happy? Being a protected area locks you into that kind of process of evaluation and, where necessary, adaptive management. And I put that at the end. The most successful ecosystem protected areas have done that process. They've looked as they go along. They've talked to people, adapted as they need. So very, very important. As I say, the basic value is to maintain the wonderful both biodiversity and also, of course, particularly in your case, the geodiversity of this country. Thank you very much.